third time back with BFO, and I could not be more honored and humbled to be invited back. It's an amazing group, the people that I've spoken with, and tonight to be able to, as you said, to put a face with each other is just amazing. And as we spoke before we went live, the things that BFO does for people is just absolutely amazing. And in a group this size, to know that we've got a participation of some 80 some odd fellow grievers out there, what we do for each other is probably just as important as anything that anyone else could do. Holding a hand with somebody else who's been through the fire is one of the most phenomenal things we could all do. So I've been asked to really come here and talk. And first, I wanted to, is nice and customary to give me a chance, because I rarely get to do this in public, to tell a little bit of my story about my Jonathan, because he is my pride and joy. Jonathan was born in 1997. And the day he was born, he was handed to his mother and I and said that he's not going to make it through the night, his very first day on earth. And if that wasn't traumatic enough, we would go through 16 amazing years of battling difficulties as far as keeping him alive, to get a prognosis that he would probably have a normal longevity to his life, only to lose him to a what should have been a routine. And trust me, if there are probably a lot of people in here in the medical field, but what should have been a relatively routine heart catheterization. I lost him on, it was June 13th. It's almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years this June since he's been gone. And to me, and I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this, it was yesterday, and it will always be yesterday, when I lost my John physically. John is here with me now. I went through the initial stages of complicated grief, like a lot of people will do, where I really repressed my grief. I avoided it, delayed it. And as we all know, repressed grief will come back and haunt us later on as much stronger grief. But I broke out of it one day in the shower. And whether you think this might have been things in my head, my synapses are snapping differently or what have you, Jonathan came to me. Felt him all around. I knew he was there. The only thing I could say was, "Hi, baby. I feel you." He wasn't as nice as I was. He said, "How dare you, Dad? How dare you not grieve me?" Things changed for me on that day. I sat down. At the time, I was working for a defense industry where I was writing responses for bids, basically, where I was writing and earning millions and millions of dollars for a company. And I thought to myself, after 6 or 9 months of really climbing out of this, and I'll be honest, I was very fortunate. I had a friend who is a phenomenal psychiatrist. I have other friends who are anthropologists. They introduced me to a number of people, and I had one burning question in my mind at the time. And it was, why did I grieve the way that I did? A lot of me felt that something was wrong with me for deferring my grief, for trying to avoid my grief, for running away and hiding from other people while I did grieve, from crying in the shower, which, by the way, was the title of my first book. Sometimes I cry in the shower. What I came away from really was finding out that I am who I am. I grieved the way that I was wired to grieve. And no matter what anyone else would tell me, I was okay. As long as I wasn't harming myself or harming other people. And I want everyone to listen to that phrase. As long as I wasn't harming myself or harming other people, I was going to grieve my way. I was going to heal to the point we'll never completely heal people. We never will. But we will get to a place where we can function without this grief interfering with a purposeful and peaceful life. So I would go on after that and do a number of things where I got to publicly speak. And one of those was at a TCF conference. I've done a couple of the Compassionate Friend conferences now, but in one particular conference, I had worked with, I don't know if you know Heidi Horsley or not, a psychiatrist out of New York. But I'd been on her television show a few times up in New York, and she had dubbed me as the noted authority on the differences in the way men and women grieve. And I had gone with that, and I'd done a number of studies along with those in the mental health field about what makes us men and women grieve differently. And at the Compassionate Friends Conference, I had put myself in a, you might think, awkward position where I volunteered to be the single man at the podium in a workshop full of nothing but women. And the idea behind it was they were going to throw every question at me about why men act the way that we do when we are going through our grieving processes. And in my mind, basically it was, I don't know, just putting my face in the eye of the storm and going, okay, send it, let's hear it. Give me everything you've got question wise, and I can take it. But it turned out to be the most phenomenal workshop that I think I've experienced in quite a long time. We had fun, we had laughs. But the one key question, and what I will, if you'll allow me, what I think I will call this session with you is, when will we have sex again? Because that was the main question that was asked when I was in the woman only group. Well, after that session, I came out of there, and Heidi said that the young lady who was supposed to be in the men's only group had backed out and was unavailable. And she asked if I would go in and I would stand in for her in the men's only group. And she said, with your knowledge of both male and female grief, maybe you'll do it well. And the point to all this is, guess what? The one question, the one overriding question of all the men had was, when are we going to have sex again? So I think when we come down to really talking about the difference in the way that men and women grieve, we really come down to, as couples, once we've experienced a loss, how do we deal with each other? We are in such a fortuitous land now where we've got things like this online where we can go and get support for ourselves. But we're at home now. How do we get along with each other when we, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, but you came upon your partner in life probably because there were differences in between you and the other person, and those differences complemented each other. But as we get into these highly emotional times, we can look at our partner and think for a moment, that person is alien. I have no idea what they're doing, no idea why they're acting the way that they're acting. They're not acting like me, and what do I do? So you'll forgive me if from time to time I look down at my notes, because I will roam from this and I will talk for hours if I don't check myself and look down at my notes. But the reason why I did, because this is all leading to one of the biggest myths that really drove me into studying the difference of men and women, how they express their emotions, particularly as they pertain to highly emotional, traumatic times such as grief. And the biggest myth was that if you experience the loss of a child, you are probably going to experience a divorce in your relationship. And I thought, well, how ridiculous is that? Let me go find some studies on that. And I found none. If you want to talk about reality, with all of the conferences and workshops that I attended, I began to take notice of the couples that were attending, because, Compassionate Friends is bereaved parents. I sat on the board of Bereaved Parents of the USA. That's all bereaved parents. I've been to a number of other workshops where it was just bereaved parents. The talks that I give for Delta Airline every year, they fly in their employees that are bereaved parents. So I had quite a bit of exposure to married couples that were bereaved parents. And what I saw was that the event actually brought them closer. And I wondered why. Why in the world did we get this myth? Because I heard it, and probably many of you have too, that were involved in a relationship when you experienced such a traumatic loss. Somebody whispered in your ear, be careful. You're probably going to end up in divorce over this. And it hit my ear, and I was shocked. So when I studied, I found out there was a phenomenal, she was actually a journalist. Her name was Harriet Schiff, and she wrote an amazing book back in 1977 called The Bereaved Parent. And being a journalist, her writing was well accepted. But in that book, she wrote that we should be careful because it will put a strain on the relationship. Well, of course, it'll put a strain on the relationship. She never once mentioned that it was going to lead to divorce. But like we do many times, somebody glommed onto that. And whether it was clergy, whether it was psychiatrists, whether it was grief counselors, whoever it was, somebody started writing that pretty hard, and it became almost something that was automatic to say to somebody that was experiencing grief as a couple that you have to be careful because this may end up in a divorce simply because of the loss. If you want to take it a little farther, I mean, if you want to go into the studies of it, yeah, we can look at the United States CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. They record causes of divorce on just about everything, whether it's infidelity, whether it's playing the ponies, whether it's drinking too much. There is not a single category in there for divorce being caused by the loss of a child. And I'm sure that it would be recorded in there if it was. So what I found at these conferences again was, a non-scientific study, but I found couples became stronger after they experienced a traumatic event. And to me, I realized we've got to be careful. Be careful what you hear from me. Don't take everything I say as gospel. We have this propensity to listen to somebody who says that they are a noted authority and listen to everything they say. What somebody says has to, number one, hit home with you. It has to resonate. It has to be something that means something to you, but then you need to check it out. And one of those that I think I could say as an example, and we're all aware of this, is Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. Again, another deal where the good doctor created a model based on the reactions of terminally ill patients and how they responded and reacted once they were given the news of their terminal illness. I think if we all put ourselves in that situation where we were told of our impending death, we'd go through anger, denial, yada, yada. We'd go through it all too. But that's not us. We're not terminally ill. We've experienced a traumatic event. But yet in the same manner, there were a number of counselors, psychiatrists, psychologists, clergy, anyone that gave counsel to the bereaved, that there would be 5 stages of grief. I don't know about you. I didn't have 5 stages of grief. I probably had 30, and I probably experienced 15 of those before I had coffee in the morning. And I probably came back to denial and anger before I had lunch, only to go to some emotion I couldn't even describe to you right now before dinner came. That's not us. In our talks about men and women, we'll pause for a minute and just let me say this. There are no phases. There are no chronological timelines. There are no stages to hit in what you and I go through. There's no point where 10 years out, I am emotionally better off than you. I still grieve. And if I stop grieving my child, I will be a hideous, hideous monster. There are feelings that are painful that I never want to lose, and don't let me lose those feelings. Those are the feelings of love. Give me a second to recover here. But if I take away the loss, I had unconditional love, and that didn't leave. I still have that same unconditional love. So again, just be careful, even sitting here listening to me now, be careful of what you hear. Make sure you validate it for yourself if it resonates with you. I tell you again, and you can't say it enough, unless you are harming yourself or others, you're going to be okay. In this great big world of how psychiatrists complicate things, not complicate things, they differentiate some people by having normal grief, although nothing is normal in grief, and complicated grief. Well, they tell you that 80% of people are going to grieve normally and 10 to 20% are going to have complicated grief. Well, they don't know me. They don't know me inside. There's one person who knows me better than anybody else, and that's me. And there are times where I could go to, knowing that Brittany is there, and Brittany is a great person for me to call and lean on when times get tough. Brittany's she's not going to be there at 3 o'clock in the morning when I'm having an awful, awful wave of just emotional grief coming over me, but I'm going to be there. And when I'm there, I can turn to myself. And many of us have to realize that even before such a traumatic and nasty thing happened to us, we were pretty good at turning to ourselves. Matter of fact, we were pretty good at giving other people advice, probably, weren't we? A lot of times when people had problems, we were freely giving them advice, but we won't give it to ourselves. Think about this. What would it be like right now if there was a knock at your door and you went and answered that door and you were standing on your front porch? How would you treat yourself? Would you give yourself counsel? Would you accept that counsel if you were that person standing there? I think you would. Just have trust in yourself. Realize that you are a person who has been through many, many traumas in your life. All right. You're going to be okay as long as you're not harming yourselves or others. But back to men and women and grief. And when I talk about men and women here, let's go back to that 80-20, because what I speak about when we talk about men and women is not gender. And we know that's a politically correct or incorrect thing to talk about now is gender. We're talking about sex. We're not talking about gender. Gender is fluid. Gender is a level of femininity and masculinity. And whether you're male or female, you could reside along that scale in a number of places. There are men that reside over farther on the female scale, and there are women that reside farther over on the men's scale. Generally, we know that men are taller than women, right? But we all know women that are taller than some men. Generally, my feet are larger than women's, but I know women that have feet larger than mine. So we talk about the 80-20s, but we talk about sex and gender at the same time. But when I talk about sex, I talk about what we were born with, if that makes sense to you. And what we were born with was DNA. And that DNA has been encoded into us since the dawn of time. I mean, whether you believe we came from the Garden of Eden or whether you think we climbed from the primordial ooze, since that very time, our bodies have been encoding inside of us lessons that we carry with us even still today. They're instincts. If we were to talk about some of the comical things, and it's kind of hard to do this when you're not in front of stage and people can laugh, but there are things that we do that you don't even think about. One of those is, and think about this, subconsciously, every time that you look at a member of the opposite sex, your mind will decide whether or not that person is good breeding stock. And it sounds silly. It's funnier when we can talk about it when we're face to face, but we all do it. We judge a person subconsciously. It might not come to your conscious mind, but your mind is going to judge whether a person is a good, bad, or indifferent person, and whether or not, because of who we started out back in the days of the Serengeti, would they be a good candidate for us to procreate. And it comes simply down to that. But going back to the Garden of Eden, we do a lot of things now for survival. Subconsciously, our mind reacts for survival reasons. And when it comes to grief, we're two different people, men and women, sex-based. And let's do the 80-20. Yes, I know that if we talk about, let's say, if I were to tell a crowd of people that it's more likely that a female is going to cry and a male is not going to cry, I will have a couple stand up and say that the husband cries and she doesn't cry. It goes back to the 80-20. Generally, 80% of the people will respond in a particular way, but know that you are as unique as snowflakes and fingerprints. Nobody is like you and you're like nobody else. But the vast majority, there are certain watermarks that we looked at. But when we go back into those days of the Serengeti, why did we get to be the way that we are right now? Well, think about those days where men went away for long periods of time on the hunt, or men went away for long periods of time at war just to defend their own village. The woman was left behind, but while the men were out, let's say they were hunting or they were at war, they were quiet, they were stealthy, they were stoic. They had to hide emotions inside that, if they did not, might betray them and get them killed either by the enemy or by the prey that they were hunting at the time, if that makes sense to everybody. Back in the village, the men, because of their stronger physical being, were the builders of structure. They set up the villages. They defended it from other bad guys coming in, but men would become the builder of homes. They would become systematic. They would become mechanistic. There would be more thought towards the mechanical than anything else. And then you take the woman, and guys, this went on not just from the dawn of time, but from the dawn of time for centuries and centuries and centuries. I mean, coding this into our DNA. And our human body, nature does a little trick on us where we encode more from the bad things that happen to us than we do from the good things that happen to us, because our mind goes into a defense or survival mode where it wants to remember not to do that again. That makes sense to everybody. But on the other hand, women were back in the village all the time. Women were left behind with all the children that they had to defend. But they also stayed back in groups because there was safety in groups. And now we get into the socialing part. Women are much more socializing than men. I think we probably all realize that. Women on average, I see a couple gentlemen here, but for the most part, if you go to a conference, and I've been to many of them, if you go to a bereavement conference, if you go to a workshop, if you go to a seminar, 95% of the attendees are women. That's because women are more likely to seek out comfort from others when she can't get it at home. And we'll talk about the importance of that in just a minute between men and women. But for those reasons and more, I mean, women had to look to each other to help survive in the village while the men was away. They became more empathetic. Women are empathizers. Men, on the other hand, are more internalized. Women are external, men are internal. But the problem comes when we try to get these emotional times, we try to get through them. And we try to do that with our partner, but our partner is responding differently than the way we are. And we don't realize that that's a good thing, right? Men actually have, and I don't know if most people realize this, but it's in clinical circles, psychological circles, I'll tell you it's true. Men actually experience far more emotions on a daily basis than a woman does. Men just internalize them. Is that nature or is that nurture? We go back to, and I want you all to think about that, especially those that have had children at this age, but little boys. Little boys are an emotional tornado, stomping their feet, holding their breath, screaming, crying until they get what they want, up until the age of around 8. A young lady, a young girl, up until around the age of 8 is far less. She doesn't become emotional until she hits around the age of 8. And the scenarios seem to just kind of become polar opposites, where she becomes emotional and he becomes more internalized. Again, is it dad saying big boys don't cry? Is it DNA inside of us telling it's time to switch on and become more stoic? We don't know. But the bottom line is, you got together probably largely out of the opposites because you complemented each other. You became a couple, you became married if you did, you became involved in a relationship because there's something that other person can do that you don't do well and you enjoy that. It's not really good to go back to biblical times, but I always tell the story of Adam and Eve where, God said he was going to give Adam a helper. And helper in that back time when the Bible was written, helper meant an equal. But God didn't make another Adam. God made an Eve. If he wanted to make another Adam, he could have just done that to give him a companion. He made someone who could do everything that Adam couldn't do. But again, we get lost in this case, especially when we start to break down the highly emotional times that I'm not going to cry. And I'm speaking me. I'm not going to cry. I'm going to become reclusive. I'm going to stay busy. I'm going to do a number of things to help me get through this thought. My spouse, on the other hand, is probably going to cry. She's going to want to talk about it. She's going to want to seek help and support because I'm probably not giving it to her. And it happens on a daily basis. It's just the way that we are. Men and women are different. If we look inside, and let's get away from grief just a minute. Let's just talk about humanity and the difference in between men and women physically. And we can start kind of in the brain. And in the brain, if you were to open up a man's head, I want you to know, if you're not aware of this already, inside of my brain, okay, there is a series of boxes, all right? It's all I have is boxes in my head. Each box has its own separate topic. And women, you can start to relate to this in a minute because you'll understand what I'm saying. I have a box for the car. I have a box for my job. I have a box for my books. I have a box for my dog. I have a box for the house. I have a box for all my bills. And if you come to me as a woman and you want to talk about any of those things, I will pull that box from my brain. I will set that box in front of me and I will open that box up. And when we're done talking about that, I will close that box back up nice and neatly, and I will put that box back in my brain and I won't think about it again, right? Your brain as a female is not designed that way. If we were open to female brain, and not to insult anybody, but you don't have boxes. You have wires. You have the house is connected to the job, and the job is connected to the dog, and the dog is connected to the rent, and the rent is connected to this, and this is connected to that. It's like the internet superhighway. Everything is connected to each other. There is no compartmentalizing like there is inside of the male brain. And the neatest thing for the male is we have this little box inside that we call the nothing box, right? There's nothing in this box. And we love this box because if we're presented with a problem that we can't solve, because men want to solve every problem. If there's a problem, if something bad happened, including loss, we want to figure out why it happened and we want to solve the issue. And if we have no answer for that, we will go right to our nothing box and we will sit on the couch with a remote in our hand and we will click through the television all night long, doing nothing but sitting in our nothing box. And I think you've all seen that. It's a great thing for us to have. And for us, it's almost therapeutic, the fact that we can sneak away and go into our nothing box and not worry about it. And I think if women, I think women will go, well, I want a nothing box. Well, no, it's for me. There's nothing in there. You'll come into my nothing box and you want to decorate it and put up curtains and bring in flowers. And I don't want that. I want my little nothing box, and let me go to my nothing box and leave it alone. But if you look at the way DNA has wired us now, there's a funny story I always tell when I'm on stage about my Becky and I. We were traveling to a bereaved parents conference, and we had just left home. We'd taken our coffee with us in our little mugs, and we'd been on the road for about an hour and a half, and singing songs, listening to the radio, having a good time. It was a beautiful day, a great drive. And about an hour and a half into the ride, Becky looks at me and she says, "Do you want more coffee?" And I looked down at my coffee cup and I was fine. So I looked at Becky and said, "No, I don't want any coffee." And I just kept driving. Well, about 5 minutes later, not hearing her sing anymore, I looked over at Becky and she was sitting there with her arms crossed and she had a smug look on her face. And I said, "Honey, what's wrong?" She says, "Nothing." I said, "What do you mean nothing? Something's wrong." She said, "Nothing's wrong. Just keep being you." What was wrong with Becky? Becky wanted coffee, right? But Becky wanted me to want coffee with her. I'm not wired that way. It's not, and yes, it would have been nice if I would have known that and thought about that, but I did not score any points that day. I did, however, pull over and get coffee for Becky and myself. So we go back to the way that men and women are. I mean, women are going to be far more empathetic than men are. Not that there aren't men who aren't going to be empathetic. Remember our gender processes in this. We're talking the 80-20 rule, okay? Women have a tendency to become a little more dysfunctional, where a man is going to want to go out and keep busy. He's got to keep his mind occupied while he's doing that. I don't know, of the men that are joining us here, I will tell you, and don't gasp at this or think that that I'm saying something rude, but I was almost, I had gratitude that I had to stay busy in preparing my son's funeral. And I did it pretty much all by myself, and not because I was trying to take control, but because she couldn't and because I needed to. And it kept my mind busy and it kept me occupied. The only problem is when we go through this, we realize that I don't understand her and she doesn't understand me. She doesn't understand why I don't want to sit down on the bed beside her and talk about it. I don't understand why she wants me to sit down on the bed and talk about it. She doesn't understand why I want to go out in my workshop and do a woodworking project all day on a Saturday because I need to just get away. And I don't understand why she wants to come into my workshop and say, "Can we just talk for a minute?" So I had really talked about this quite a bit in another podcast I had done with somebody who asked me what the secret was. What's the secret in getting a man and woman to really understand that they are opposites for a reason and that their opposites are actually going to complement them in their recovery through such a traumatic time. And I said, communication. And she goes, well, what's the secret to communication? And I said, I don't know. They've got to communicate. Communicate with your partner. Let your partner know that you now understand that he or she is going to grieve differently than you are. I tell you, kind of a bad thing that I went through. And one of the things that sort of forced me to pursue this whole, why am I wired to be the way that I am? But I had people tell me that that I needed to go get help. And I said, well, I'm doing okay. I don't think I need to go get help. Well, that's why you need to go get help, is because you don't realize that you're not doing okay. Well, I feel like I'm doing okay. Well, if you don't feel like you need help, then you need help. The other part was I had a spouse, my mother's child, who came to me and said, you're not crying. And if you're not crying, then you must not have loved our child the way that you said that you loved him. And for a couple of weeks, that hit me. I honestly got to the point where I thought, maybe I didn't love my child. And then something inside of me said, no, 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 stop right there. You had nothing but unconditional love for that child. Don't let anyone come along and tell you that you don't. Okay. So remember, I've said a lot of words and I've said them rather quickly. Realize that divorce is not an automatic thing when we go through child loss or any trauma. We're going to act differently. Respect your spouse, respect the opposite sex, the way that they're wired to do. And if we go back to one of the most important things in this is to remember that you are you, unless you're harming yourself or you're harming others, you're going to be okay. Forget the chronology, forget the phases, forget the steps. Know where your spouse is, know where you can go. Guys, sometimes you got to do what I did and walk into that room full of nothing but women and put your face in the storm and listen, whether you like it or not. Women, sometimes you've got to understand that he's just going to walk away and he's going to go to his man cave. Let him go to his man cave. He's healing in a way that he needs to heal internally. As I told you before, men experience far more emotions than women. We just internalize those emotions. We don't show them on the outside. So when somebody looks at me and said that I am not grieving, I was grieving. I grieve today. I grieve on the inside. And that's more important to my healing journey than anything else, is to know that I'm facing and that I am processing those emotional feelings that I have inside. I know we got to start wrapping it up and go to the Q&As in a second, but emotions are like everything else that we take into our body, believe it or not. If we take in air, we have got to use that air for some physical purpose and then expel the waste. If we take in food, same thing. Use it for energy and expel the waste. We take in water, same thing. Use it for energy and expel. We take in emotions. We've got to use the energy from those emotions and then expel them. If you retain those emotions, if you hold them back, if you dam them up inside, they will build up, guys in particular, until they explode. So for the couple of men that are here, that's my gift to you. You don't have to change who you are to grieve. Nobody else has to see it. You simply have to face those emotions inside and internally process them in whatever way you can. And if that means sometimes go cry in the shower, then sometimes go cry in the shower. At least you're getting them out. I want to thank you all for listening to that. And I would love now to have the opportunity to open it up for any questions and answers, or questions you have and answers that I might have.